Welcome back. It is Thursday, April 30th. I hope everyone is doing well. See quite a few people who were here last time. Last time we did doing different attacks and what is a threat. This time, as Mr. Simon said, we're going to review defense in chess. And I want to start with a story about this. It was a personal chess story of mine. And a long time ago, I was an up-and-coming player, and I had a friend of mine who was an up-and-coming player about my level. And that player, I hadn't talked to him in a few months, and he shot up several hundred rating points. And he shot up all the way to the A class, and I was still in the C class. And he said to me, "Mr. Fugatte, do you want to know how I got to be an A-class chess player?" I was much younger. Yes, I do. How did you get to be an A-class chess player? And he said, "I didn't lose any pieces." Now, that seems pretty simple, but when you really think about it, it's very hard to play a game of chess and not lose any pieces. I lost a pawn here or there, but I did not lose any pieces. And if we pay attention to our defenses in the game and look at the moves, we can go through a game and do the best we can to not lose pieces. So with that, I'm going to quickly review a little bit of what we talked about last time. So last time we reviewed attacks and threats, and I'm just going to briefly show you what a threat is. So if white makes the move bishop to g3, the bishop can now see the pawn. And that means that the bishop can take the pawn. So this is an attack. But the important thing is they are going to win points. There's nothing black can do to stop white from taking the pawn on the next move. So that makes it a threat. So a threat wins points. Now everybody knows the value of the pieces. Pawns are worth 1, knights and bishops 3, rooks 5, and queens 9. So everybody should know that going in. So now everybody has reviewed a threat and knows the value of the pieces. With that, we're going to move to our first way to defend. All right, we have a similar position, but in this example, we are going to make a threat for white. White moves their bishop. The bishop can see the pawn and is going to take it, but black has a way to make it safe. The first way to make a piece safe and make a defense is to run away. This piece is in danger. Black simply moves it. It is now on a safe square, and white cannot see it anymore. This is the first simple way to make a piece safe. You just move it. So you notice the piece is being threatened, you run away. Moving on. Our second example. White is once again going to make a threat. The rook can now see the pawn on c6. Black needs to make this piece safe. Running away won't help. The rook would still take it. So instead, black moves rook to c8. Now notice, black did not move this piece away. So white can still take it. But we know the value of the pieces. White only got 1 point. On black's next move, they can take the rook and get 5 points. This is called a guard. So we are moving the rook to guard another piece. The piece can still be taken, but you will not lose points. And that's the important thing about defense, is that you don't lose points or get checkmated, which is dealing with a threat. So this is no longer a threat to win points, is it? Because black can capture back. So this is a guard. We are protecting the piece with another one. Moving on to our third defense. All right, in this example, white is going to move their bishop. In this case, the bishop can see the knight. Not the knight, the rook. Sorry. The bishop can see the rook. The rook is worth 5 points, and even though the rook is guarded, the bishop is only worth 3. So black is going to lose points, even using the guard. So Black needs to come up with a way to defend it. In this case, we are going to use block. The pawn moves forward. The bishop can now no longer see the rook. It sees the pawn instead. And this pawn is only worth 1 point. So if white takes it, this pawn is also guarded. And we went over guard. So if they were to take, they would lose points. Now, one more thing. In this position, we can block with the other pawn as well. However, just because it's blocked doesn't mean that it's going to help. We could block with this pawn. However, white can simply capture the pawn and see the rook again because that pawn is not guarded or defended in any way. And then, if we try this, we take the other one and we still have the same problem. So notice there were 2 pawns that could guard, or could block, but only one, which was the guarded one, was the correct one. Our fourth defense. Sometimes white makes an aggressive move, and they have now made a threat on the knight, and the knight cannot run away. We cannot move our king over to guard it, and we have nothing to block with. However, most of you out there already see that this is a pretty terrible move. This is the best way to defend. We capture the piece. If we can just simply take the piece, it's usually the best way to defend, isn't it? Unfortunately, it's the one that students look for least often. Most often when there's a threat, or a check even, checks are also threats on the king, students don't even look to take the piece. They usually try to run away first, but oftentimes there are better defenses. And in this case, we could just simply take the rook. Very easy. Finally, I want to go into a complicated defense. This is not as much a defense as it is an attack, but it is a way to make a piece safe. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make our pieces safe. So in this example, white is going to move their bishop, and the bishop sees the rook. And we know that the rook is worth 5 and the bishop is worth 3. So we're going to win points here, even though the rook is guarded. It can't run away. We can block, but like the pawn move from the last example, it's not very good. We could just simply take it and the same problem exists. So we're in a little bit of a pickle here. However, black does have a defense. It's a complicated one. This is called a counterattack. Instead of guarding, blocking, capturing, or running away, black is going to make their own attack and attack the rook. So now, if white were to take the rook and the king were to take back, you would lose 2 points. However, we're still going to get this rook because white has no way to make it safe. Now, in the next move, black is going to take it and get 5 points. So really, they're going to have won an extra piece. So that's a little complicated, but we're defending with attacking. White has a better move. We'll get into that right now. So instead, white needs to recognize, hey, I can't take this rook because it's bad. And so the correct move here is bishop to g2, blocking the attack. Now the bishop just sees the bishop, and they can trade. And 3 for 3 is a fair trade, and we know we can always make a fair trade. So that's a little more complicated. You don't always have to look for this. As a matter of fact, most students counterattack far more often than they should because they see you all see your own attacks, and your own attacks are the best attacks ever, and you don't really pay attention to your opponent's attacks. For those of you who were here last week, we started looking for threats in our game. So that's what you need to do. So when you see the threat, you don't always have to make your own attack or counterattack. Sometimes it works, but usually not the first one I would go to. So those are our 5 basic defenses as shown. And I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Simons and see if we have any questions.
All right. So we've covered the basic ideas of these defenses, and we'll be going into more detail about how to use them better. But before that, do we have any questions about defending in chess?
In this case on the screen, would it be better to capture the other team's rook, or would it be better to move your bishop back?
I went over that. I'll go back over it again. So if we were to capture the rook, we would get 5 points. But then black doesn't have to take right now. This is the trick. If you just took, then you could both back the bishops up and it would be a fair trade. But black can take the bishop. And now the bishop still sees the rook. White has no way to make a defense. The only thing they could do is block, but that would just get taken. So if you take the rook, no matter what move white makes, you still lose the rook on the next move. And then black has 2 bishops and white only has 1. So to answer your question in short, it is definitely much better to block with the bishop.
What happens when you put the bishop on the attack of the rook?
White or black bishop?
Yeah, the black bishop.
Okay.
Then, sir, when there's another move, but it will be material onto e4 will just block the bishop, but the bishop's gonna capture and still it's gonna be up.
That is absolutely correct. Very good that you saw that.
And they will have the same material.
Well, not necessarily. Because if the pawn comes forward, we're attacking the bishop, but black gets to make a defense, right? So this is a threat. So we're going to use which defense here?
Capture.
Capture. So we're going to capture. So we get 1 point, and now we're still attacking the rook, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so we're still attacking the rook, and we gain 1 point. So that didn't really make it safe, did it? And remember, the point of defense is we want to make our pieces safe. And that wasn't safe. We just lost the pawn. And now there's all kinds of problems that white's going to have to get into. And we can still guard our bishop, but now black gets to make moves like this. Check the king. This is going to get complicated and difficult. But it's still a playable game. But I just wanted to, that just gave away a pawn you didn't have to give away. So there was no reason to move this pawn forward because it was not protected. It wasn't safe.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. All right, Mr. Simons, are we moving on or
Yep, it looks like
are we down or
we are going to be about 10 more minutes, and then we'll be done with the lesson.
Okay.
We'll take any questions, but if you need to leave when the lesson's over, that is fine. If you'd like to stick around and ask more questions, that's okay too. We have about 4 more minutes to finish. Let's go ahead and get to the next part.
Okay, the next part is pretty simple. We're going to review what we had, but we're going to, instead of putting these complicated positions that for instruction on the board, we're going to actually look at real defense that you're going to see in your actual games. So our first example is this one here. Black is just first move of the game, move their knight out. So white's moved up their pawn, black moves out their knight. And this knight is making an attack on the pawn, and it's a threat. So in this example, we're going to have to make this piece safe. And there's a few ways to do it, but the best way is to just run away. We move the pawn forward because now not only do we make the piece safe, we make our own threat on the knight, don't we? And now black has to make their piece safe. So not a lot of good ways to do that. You can't block because it's right next to you. You can't guard because it's already guarded, but guarding doesn't help, does it? This is worth 1 and this is worth 3, so it's afraid of it. So we can't guard, we can't block, we can't capture it. So we're going to have to run away. And the knight moves. And we could do this again. The pawn comes forward and attacks the knight. Once again, same problem. We're going to have to run away. So this is an example of running away as a defense in a real game. This is an actual game that could be played. You could play this over the board, in the tournament coming up on Friday. All right. We're going to move on to the next one, real game defenses guard.
Before you go on to the next example, Mr. Fugatte, I had a question a student asked earlier about what is the best defense. I thought it might be good to mention that each defense is useful, but when that defense is best. So I felt like if I could interject, we're talking
Go
about
ahead.
running away as a defense. Running away is the best defense when the attacker is worth less points than you. Would you agree?
I would say that most often that is correct.
The knight running away from a pawn is because you can't really guard block for the knight. So running away is often the best defense if the attacker is weaker than the defender. Moving on.
Very good. So we're going to move on to, all right, it looks like this, no, there's no bishops on the board. I don't know what I did there. The knight has come out and is attacking the pawn. We have to guard the pawn. This is the second move of the game for most of you. So this is a pretty simple way to play. Everybody's seen this sort of opening before. Knight attacks the pawn, knight guards the pawn. All of the opening principles are still there, and we make it safe. You could also play the pawn forward here. This would also make it safe and is a good way. But we can't run away here. So the best thing to do is guard. We can't block it because it's a knight. That's something I didn't mention. If a knight attacks it, you can't block it because it jumps. Knight's the only piece. So you can never block a knight attack. And in this case, it can't run away. There's not really a good counterattack. So the best thing to do is just simply move out your knight or pawn and guard. That way, if the knight takes, they get 1 point. The knight takes back and gets 3. And we wouldn't want to do that. So that makes it safe. Everybody with me so far? We're going to move on to the next defense. Real game. You know, you all may see this in your actual game. And this is a very, very common opening strategy. Pawns, knights, bishop. And now, white moves and makes a threat. The knight attacks f7. And it's guarded. But the bishop also attacks f7. So we have 2 on it and only 1 defending it. And we can't get any pieces over there to guard. The queen doesn't help because she's afraid of the knight and bishop. Because if you move the queen up, takes, and you lose points. You only got 6 and you lost 10. So that's no good. So there's no way to guard this pawn. We can't run away. And worse, if the knight gets to take, it actually makes a tactical fork on the queen and rook. So this is a bad spot. There's really only 1 move, and we have to block. Now, we know we can't block the knight, so we have to block the bishop. With that, the pawn comes forward. Now the bishop can't see up here. Now, I know this is a complicated position, but it's from a real game, and you all might see this. You need to know the pawn comes forward. If the bishop takes, renewing the threat, then the knight can take. And now the pawn takes back. And we've made an even trade. Knight and pawn for bishop. And, well, the queen can take the pawn, or we can take the knight and get complicated. Let's just take the pawn and not be complicated. For bishop and pawn. So we made, let's go back to the position. There, in this position, we play d5, and then bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, and then queen takes. And that's an even trade, 4 for 4. So we blocked the attack by moving the pawn, wrong thing, moving the pawn, and made the defense. So now the bishop can no longer see here. So this is an excellent move for, well, and usually the pawn takes. And so we say, well, what if the pawn takes? Well, you know, you can do that. And then the black has several good moves here. Taking back is just fine. And now the bishop still can't see it because the knight's in the way. Could also play knight to a5, attacking the bishop. It's another good move. There's several different ways to play this. I'm not getting into all that. But the important thing that you see is that you have to block the attack. And this is a real game from the fried liver attack. Moving on. Real game defenses. All right, so we're going to make the same attack, but this time the position's not the same because the knight didn't come out this time. The bishop came into play instead. But some students who play this don't pay attention to that sort of detail and decide to make their threat anyway. And this is a terrible mistake because the queen captures the knight and it's a free piece. We have defended by capture. This is the way we make our stuff safe, this time by just simply taking the knight. And now black has all sorts of threats. So we have done runaway, guard, block, and capture. And these are your 4 main defenses. However, there's also the counterattack, which is a way to defend. So we're going to show a similar position. It'll be this one right here. So it looks like we have just captured, but white thinks they have a sneaky move. D4. Now, some of you may remember a similar move from last week because this is our distraction move. We're making threats and attacks on the bishop and pawn here. But when we moved, we also revealed the super secret attack on the queen that they might miss. So it looks like there is nothing that black can do here. How can they make everything safe? Black can make a counter attack, and they have one good move here. Queen captures pawn. Now, I know what you're saying. The pawn's only worth 1, and they're going to take that bishop that's worth 3, but we made a new threat. So we made our queen safe by running away, and we captured a pawn, and we've made a threat on the rook. So if they were to take the bishop, we would take the rook. So they would get 3, we would get 5, and check the king. And we all know that check is the best thing ever. So we definitely want to check.
So maybe you had a little bit of it.
Did you catch
it? Heard it.
Okay. Check is the best thing ever. I like to repeat this. So, but it is very good in this position. So, and black has 1 point here. We could go back and count, but this is definitely the best defense is to make a counterattack here. So those are 5 examples that could come from a real game that you all could play, showing all of the different defenses. All right, so we're going to move on to an actual game, and we're going to start using some of these attack and defense skills. I'm not going to linger too much, but it's an interesting game. This is a Steinitz game. Steinitz is playing white in this one, and he's playing nobody important who has the black pieces. So normal openings like we see. Now we're going to bring out our knights into play, and these are defensive moves. They actually guard the pawn. So this is a more defensive way to play. Normally we bring out this knight. But in this game, they don't. And now we're going to bring the pawn forward. Many of you have seen this. This is called the Vienna Gambit, but you don't need to know that. But it makes a threat here, and black is simply going to take the pawn. So now black is up a pawn. White moves to the middle and makes a threat. But this allows the best move in chess. Check. So this is a threat, and the king, we can't block here, because if we do, it's very, very bad, because then the pawn takes, and now we're threatening to move forward, checking and winning the rook and making a queen. It's very bad. So we can't actually block there. So the only move is to move the king forward. And this looks pretty terrible, but it's actually okay. B6. Now black wants to bring their bishop out and terrorize the white king some more because the king is in the middle of the board. Oh, sorry. So now the knight comes forward. This blocks the check that could be coming and makes a threat to capture the pawn, checking the king and rook. The bishop comes to attack the knight, and it is a threat because nothing's protecting it, and the knight can't run away and do their thing because then the king gets taken. So white guards the knight using the pawn. Pawn protects the knight, so if the bishop takes, the pawn will take back and make it a fair trade. The queen retreats to h5 and checks the king. Probably not the best move, because now white blocks. Notice they blocked the threat with the knight. Very good move, moving their knight out and blocking. The bishop captures, checking the king, and white captures back. Not only do they capture back and make a threat on the knight. However, black has a really clever defense. See, white sees that the knight doesn't look good moving here or here, and certainly doesn't look good moving backwards. It can't take the pawn because it's guarded, and it can't move to e5 because it would get taken. So there's no good squares for the knight, but that's okay. The queen captures the pawn, and now black has won another pawn. Not only did they capture the pawn, they made a check. So the king slides over to f2, where it is safe. King runs away, and the bishop can now see the queen. So we're going to make the queen move again. And as we all know, we don't want to move the queen too many times. Look at this. All these pieces still on the back row. Now the bishop comes out. So white gets another piece out and takes back one of the lost pawns. Not only does it take back a lost pawn, it makes a threat on this pawn. Black moves out their knight. They're making a counterattack. Rather than guard this pawn, they make their own attack on the pawn on e4, which because they will take and check the king. White plays e5, running away and attacking the knight. The knight jumps into d5 rather than check the king. The bishop retreats. They did it because rather than attack the king, they wanted to attack the bishop. So now white's bishop has to run away. The queen moves to h6. This is looking for, it looks like a move that you wouldn't notice, but it's a very good move. They're looking to go right here. And if they put the queen right there with the knight protecting it, that is actually a checkmate. So this is a big threat for checkmate. So white has to guard it. They move their queen up to see the square and guard it. The bishop moves out to e7. Looks like black is preparing to castle. The queen moves to e4. This still guards here, but now makes a threat on the knight. The queen has to guard. There's no other way to guard, and the knight really doesn't have a good square to move to, so the queen moves over and protects the knight. The bishop comes into play, getting the last piece into play, and now makes a threat on the knight because now there are two on it and only one guarding it. Black has a super complicated, clever defense. Knight to f6. If the pawn takes the knight, the queen takes the queen, and you lose the queen. If the bishop takes the queen, the knight takes the queen with check. And then we could capture back the bishop. So this is a super complicated defense. It is a counterattack. And this is why the counterattacks are very hard. And white moves queen to e2 to save the queen and protect the bishop, which is still attacking that queen. The knight moves to g4, checking the king. One of the things I'll tell you about defense students is when you only have one way out, in this case, we can't block, we can't capture, we can't guard the king, we have to run away. You need to look at what square to put your king on. And Mr. Steinitz did not look at the right square. He plays the king to f1, which is a mistake. He should have played to e1. It is a huge mistake because now the queen captures the bishop and wins the piece. I know what you're saying. Mr. Fugatte, he just hung the queen. And white takes the queen. But no, there's a secret move. Knight to e3 check, forking the king and queen. If the king had been on e1, this couldn't have happened. Now the only thing to do is move the king and lose the queen. And white gave up in this position rather than continue on down a piece against another strong master. So that is an example of playing a game, looking at the different threats and trying to solve each one with a good defense. And notice there's lots of different, we used all the different defenses in that and parried a lot of different threats until the very end.
Thank you guys for joining us in. Anything you want to say, Mr. Fugatte?
I just want to thank everybody for coming out. I always enjoy it. And I guess I will see you next week. We'll be working with rooks. Looking forward to it.
All right. right. Goodbye.